Hi, I'm Tony. Welcome to Sew Lounge. Today we are going to be making the sleeve on version D of Simplicity 9011, which is a raglan sleeve knit dress. There are a couple of different sleeve variations and we're going to be doing D, which has the cuff on it. Sew Lounge is the place for beginners to learn to sew one pattern at a time. Be sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss a stitch. So at this point, we have the dress completely made. So the neckband is in, the shoulder seams are done, and the side seams are all sewn together. So I am ready to start gathering the sleeve and then making the cuff. Now, at this point, I have all of the inside seams of my dress pressed open. And you can see that they're all pressed open. And that is going to be helpful when we start to put in a basting stitch to make the gathers, because we do not want the seam getting chunky in the gathering. We want everything to lie nice and smooth. And if you've been following along, we are going to be starting with step number 16, which is the specific way to put together the sleeve band for sleeve in version D. Let's go in for a closer look. So this is the pattern. It is Simplicity 9011. We are going to be making the sleeve for version D, which has that little cuff on it. I'm doing the cuff in a contrasting green color just to kind of add some additional design to the dress. And we are going to be starting here with step number 16, which is going to be the gathering of the band. And we're going to first start at a 5/8 inch from the outside edge, and then we're going to sew a second basting line at 1/4 of an inch. Then we're going to make the tube for the cuff, and that is piece number 7, which I have cut out, and it's over here on the side. And then we are going to attach the cuff to the sleeve from the outside and then flip it to the inside and press. So that is what we're going to be doing today. Let's head over to the sewing machine. We're starting at step number 16, and if you read the instructions in capital letters, it says sew from the outside. So while I would usually sew my seam allowances open from the inside of the garment so I could see them, in this case, we are going to be sewing from the outside. The other thing we're going to do is we are going to start sewing and putting in that basting stitch on the underside of the sleeve. So we're going to be sewing around the cuff, but we're going to start from the seam that goes under the arm and down the side of the dress. And then to get our machine all set up, first we want to remove any kind of a platform, or if your machine is down on a table, make sure you lift it out. And the reason we're doing this is because we are going to be sewing in the round. So we're going to be putting that sleeve over this free arm of the sewing machine, and Clementine has come to visit. And we are going to be sewing in a circular stitch line to finish the cuff and the sleeve and put them both together. So you need this free arm available to be able to do that easier. You can do it if everything's flat, but it's much more difficult, so make sure you do this. Next, make sure that you have a ballpoint needle in your sewing machine. If you've changed it out, if you stopped something, stopped doing this vid dress and started working on something else, just make sure you've got a ballpoint needle in. And last but not least, make sure that your sewing machine is set to a basting stitch, because we're going to be basting. Now, on my Bernina, a basting stitch is a 5. On my Brother machine, it is a 4. So just check whatever the longest stitch length is for your sewing machine, and that's the one you want to use. So let's get everything ready and go in for a closer look. I have my measuring gauge, and I'm just going to double check 5/8 of an inch, and then I put my magnetic seam gauge up there to help me keep everything all lined up. I'm going to lower my presser foot, and I'm starting just in front of this seam, the actual stitched seam line. So we're just going to do a quick basting stitch around. And as you come around to the other side, just make sure you're holding that seam allowance open so they don't get folded up in there while you're basting. And then we're coming back around and we want to pull these threads out of the way and keep that seam allowance open. Okay. So we've got the first stitch line sewn in. So now we've got the second stitch line and we want that to be 1/4 of an inch from the line we just sewed. So since this is the line we just sewed, we're going to take that 1/4 of an inch and that will put it right at the stitch line if we use the outside edge of the presser foot to hold everything together. So just get it all lined up. We're doing the exact same thing all the way around. Moving on to step number 17, we are going to be making the cuff. And I like to keep my pattern pieces attached to everything until I'm ready to sew them. That way I know that I'm sewing the right side, especially when I'm using solid color fabric. Sometimes it's hard to tell until you get it all sewn together and realize you did it wrong. So when I cut this out, I used the right side of the fabric was on top and on the bottom. So this is the right side of my fabric. So once I remove this pattern piece, I'm going to fold the seam allowance towards the inside because that means that this is the outside and we're going to fold them together to match up this little notch on the side. If you didn't cut your notches, cut it before you take your pattern piece off. And then we are going to be stitching this together to form the seam for the cuff. So I'm just going to put some pins in real quick and make sure that that little notch is lined up. Let's go in for a closer look. To sew the side seam, the directions do not specify a seam allowance width, which means we are going to be sewing at 5/8 of an inch. So you can grab your gauge. If you have an obvious line on your sewing machine, you can line up with that. And if you need some extra help, you can always use a magnetic seam gauge. So I'm going to get lined up. And I want to make sure that my machine is no longer on a basting stitch. So I'm going to stitch this on a straight stitch at about a 3. Since it's knit, I want it to be able to stretch a little bit. And I'm just going to get everything lined up, roll my needle in, and I'm going to start stitching. Pulling out that pin as I get to it. And we're just coming down to the other end. I'm going to just lift that up. And that is the outside of the cuff. Moving on to step number 18, the instructions say to fold the band in half, wrong sides together, matching the notch at the top, and then press before basting the cuff together. Now, the problem with that is that if you just fold this cuff in half, those seams aren't going to be lying nice and flat. So we want to take a sec, press open the seam inside of the cuff before we fold it wrong sides together to make sure that it is nice and smooth on the inside. Let that cool for a sec. And then we will press it again once we've flipped it. So just line up the seam. The easiest way to do that is to line up the seam on itself so you know that those seam allowances are nice and open and flat. And then you can move around the top to match that notch. And then just kind of smoothing everything out, making sure that that top edge is all matched up on itself. And then just smoothing to get a nice rectangular cuff without any lumps and bumps. So we do not want any lumps and bumps. And then you can still, from the side where we have the seam, just smooth it all out, press that bottom edge of the cuff and the sides. While we're at it, let's head to the sewing machine and do some basting. back at the sewing machine, and my machine is set to a basting stitch again. And because it doesn't say, you would think that we would sew this at 5/8 of an inch, which you can if you want, but usually basting stitches go inside of the seam allowance. So I am just going to stitch this at 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to line this up with the outside edge of my presser foot and just run a quick basting stitch around. Now you are probably going to stretch out your cuff a tiny bit just because it's smaller than your free arm. That's okay. We're sewing it on a basting stitch, so it'll have a little bit of give, and then we will go do this again with the wider seam once we get to attaching it to the actual sleeve. So now we're at step number 19, and you should have your cuff all pressed. It should be basted at the top. If you haven't trimmed off these basting stitches, just trim them. There are going to be a lot of loose threads on the inside of this cuff once we get to the gathering and putting it all together. So you don't really need these for anything in particular. They're just holding this together. So we are going to be working from the outside of the garment. And if you read the instruction, we're going to pin the band at the lower edge of the sleeve, matching the underarm seam and the notch. Now, the first time I made this with the other sleeve, I didn't realize there was a notch in here. So if you go look at your sleeve, you will see on the back side of the, or the front side of the dress, there is a little notch on the sleeve. That is what we want to match with the notch on the band. So we are going to line this all up and kind of just squeeze it in there for now, and then we will start gathering. So take your cuff, and so that the raw edge is going to be facing the raw edge of the sleeve, and we're just going to stick it in there. Let's go in for a closer look, and we're going to get everything all lined up. All right, so this is the sleeve. We kind of have it all jammed up in there, and it's kind of messy, and there's a lot of extra fabric, as you can see. So we are going to start by matching the notch with the notch on the sleeve fabric, and I'm just going to match those up at the bottom of that point, and then kind of scooch everything back over so it's all lined up. Grab a pin and put that in place. And then I'm going to go around, and this is the underarm seam, as you can see. So that's the curve. And that is the side of the cuff that we want to match with the seam of the dress. Now, these threads on the inside, we're not going to be messing with them. Those are on the right side of the fabric. So we're going to be pulling the bobbin threads, which are on the wrong side of the fabric, to gather. So you can just tuck those down into the sleeve, along the sleeve between the cuff, and get that out of the way. And then you want to put some pins in to line this up here. So I'm just gonna, and it's kind of chunky, so might need to put a couple, but we'll start with one. So now the instructions want us to get this whole mess in here gathered to fit the sleeve. So to do that, we are going to pull the bobbin threads. Now, we've got two sets of bobbin threads. We've got ones to the left and ones to the right. So if we start, we can pull them. It's easier if you kind of get them out of the way. So let me pull that here. There we go. Okay, so if you start pulling them, and it's easy if you hold the top and the bottom at the same time. That's going the other way, so we don't want that one. Okay. So this is the top and the bottom, and we're going to hold on to them, and then we're going to slowly just gather that sleeve. And you can just slide it along to just gather it a little bit, and then kind of get it going all the way around. So this is where you just kind of have to work with it until you can kind of get it to fit. So work on sliding that around, and then let's see how big it still is. Oh, it's huge. Okay. Keep pulling and working on the gathering part. And you always want to pull the bobbin threads. You want to hold the bobbin threads and slide it along because that is going to be the side that moves. If you pull from the top threads, then it's not going to slide and you could actually break your basting threads, which kind of defeats the whole purpose. So let's see how we're looking. Oh, it's still big. And now you do not want to move, we're gathering between these points. So we're gathering between this point where the notch is and the top seam. So that's a lot more to gather than there is on the other side. But just keep working with it. Until you kind of have it so that it lines up and it starts to fit a little bit. So that looks pretty good over to that point. And what we want to do is try and keep the gatherings even. And this is really the hardest part of this entire dress. So if you don't want to make it super complicated, you want to do this fast, then don't do this sleeve. But since we've already made the easier version, we're going to do this. And it's going to be really cute once it's done. So we just need to put in a little more effort. Okay, let's see. So what we're doing is the whole purpose of gathering is to be able to line up this top edge of the gathers with this band. So this is looking really good on this side. So before I go over to the other side, I'm going to put in some pins to hold all those gathers in place because I don't want that coming out while I'm messing with the other side. Okay, there we go. So that's looking pretty good. And now we're going to go back inside to the bobbin threads and we're going to grab the threads that are going that way, which are going to be that one and there we go. Okay, so it's going to be these two. And now we're going to start pulling to gather this other little section between this pin and the seam on the cuff where we have the other pin. And you just want to keep pulling and adjusting. And the good thing about gathering is you can always pull it back out. So if it's gathered too much, you can always pull it back out. You don't have to worry about that. So you kind of have to just get it going to be able to make this work and get this bigger amount of fabric onto the smaller amount of fabric. So that's looking pretty good. Let's get that all even. There we go. It's looking pretty good. Just put in a couple of pins to hold all this in place through here. And if you go around, you can kind of even them all out if they're not, they're a little too bunched in one place than the other. And that's what it should look like. And now we're going to go over to the sewing machine. We're back at the sewing machine for the last time, and we are getting ready to stitch the cuff and the sleeve together where we've pinned it after we have gathered. Now, before we start any sewing, make sure that your sewing machine is set to a regular stitch length. So you want to take it off of basting. I have been sewing my knit fabric at a 3 length. That'll account for the stretch a little bit, but still be a straight stitch, which is what the pattern is showing that we should be sewing. So we are going to be trimming off these basting threads just so they're kind of out of the way and not getting caught up in what we're getting ready to sew. And we are going to be sewing at 5/8 of an inch because the pattern doesn't specify. And we are going to be starting at the bottom of the cuff where the seam is and sliding it over the free arm of the machine, getting everything lined up. Let's go in for a closer look. All right, so as usual, we are sewing at 5/8 of an inch. That is going to be that first mark on my machine. Because this is really thick, I am going to use my magnetic seam gauge to make sure I have everything all lined up. And I am going to take out this first pen to get everything in the right spot. We are going to start a little bit ahead of this seam line on the cuff. I'm going to lower my presser foot, and it's really chunky through there because you got all these seam allowances. And then I am going to start sewing, rolling my needle down first. Okay, now we're ready. Let's start stitching. Just go slow and make sure you remove those pins It is kind of chunky through here because you do have the gathers and there's a bunch of layers. And we are just coming back around. I am just going to go back over that original stitch to just lock these in place. And then raise it up. And we have our first stitch line in place. Now we are going to go back and stitch 1/4 of an inch from the stitch line we just sewed. So we're going to get everything back over this free arm. Get it all lined up again. This time we are going to line up the edge of the presser foot with the edge of the seam that we just stitched, just like before when we were basting, but this time we are putting in a permanent stitch. So just repeat the process. And we are just coming back around and lift up that presser foot. And now we have them both stitched, so we are going to flip, look at that finished stitch line. We're going to go back in and pull out that basting, but we are going to head to the sewing machine to finish this up. So once you have finished sewing the cuff to the sleeve band, we're going to flip it out so everything is going to be wrong side out. And then we are going to go specifically to the cuff and we are going to take that seam that we had sewed because it was going this way, and we're going to flip it up towards the shoulder part of the sleeve, and then we are going to press this going up. Because that's what the instructions tell us to do in step number 20. So that's what we're doing. We're just going to give that a quick press. And you can iron your dress at this point if you're going to wear it soon. And then just flip it over and then just press it from the other side as well. And then repeat on the other side. So now you know how to make a knit cuff and attach it to a gathered sleeve. This is going to be the finished sleeve on view D. Last step is going to be to put the hem in. I actually think that was a step before we did the sleeve, but we're just doing the sleeve in this video so you can see how it looks. I'm really happy with the contrasting collar and cuffs. I think that's a nice little accent. And if you follow along with these steps, you can sew this too. It's not as hard as it looks, and every time you do it, you'll get a little bit better. So the more practice you get gathering, the better you'll get. The more you practice sewing with knits, the better you get. Everything is all about improving one pattern at a time. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to click like and subscribe to my channel so you never miss a stitch. And if you've got questions but no one to answer them, head on over to Let's Talk Sewing for Beginners. It's an interactive Facebook group where you can ask all the questions you want and I will get you some answers. There's a link in the description below this video, so click on it to join. Until we meet again, happy sewing!